I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show. That's Gray with an E. And you can stream us live at 11 a.m. Pacific time on Fridays when we include your questions and comments. And we cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely topics, stimulating and distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. And those of you who are listening to us now, if you have a question that you want to bring to the fore or a comment, please feel free to do so. In today's episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, we meet University of Wisconsin sociologist Jessica Calarco. She's best known for her research on inequities in education and family life. She's a graduate of Brown with a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and is author of several books, including Negotiating Opportunities, a field guide to grad school, and quantitative literacy, and she has received awards for both her writing and her teaching. Her writing has appeared in a number of publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Atlantic, Inside Higher Ed, Newsweek, and Fortune. And we welcome Jessica Calarco to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. Delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I guess the place to begin is with privilege, maybe, because you write a lot about it and you talk about it, and privilege particularly linked to class. A lot of your research, and I want to talk about the research, and we'll get some responses to it. It tells us that the middle class kids are trained to negotiate better and to be more autonomous and to maybe get what they want more. They have more access usually to computers and tutors and that sort of thing, but they can advocate for themselves in an autonomous way and they can have more agency. And this has been proven over and over again by a lot of the research that you've done. Can't these working class kids be taught more to have these skills?
So I think one of the challenges on that front is that it comes not only from learning that you should ask for help or that you should negotiate or even how to do so, but about having the trust in institutions that they will respond to the kinds of requests that you make. And so certainly there are programs out there that have been designed to teach kids from working class backgrounds or other marginalized groups how to advocate for themselves. But what the research shows on that front is that it's hard to overcome the trust gaps. It's hard to get kids, whose families have been marginalized and mistreated by institutions, who themselves have been marginalized and mistreated by these institutions, to feel confident making those kinds of requests. And it's also, on the flip side, hard to get educators, for example, to recognize the sort of validity of the requests that they're making in some cases, that their requests, especially if they're more frequently experiencing problems in the classroom by virtue of, say the fact that they have less family support at home because their parents are working multiple jobs, the more those kids are making requests, the easier it is for teachers to question whether they're as motivated or as hardworking as their peers, from more privileged groups. And so certainly, there is value in encouraging kids from all backgrounds to feel comfortable, speaking up for their needs and advocating for themselves. But I think we have to be careful about assuming that simply telling kids this is what you should be doing can overcome those kinds of inequalities and lead to a more equitable set of outcomes in school.
And your team has gone, I know, to the trouble of talking not only to the kids themselves, but to the parents, to the teachers, to all who are involved in the conclusions that you come to here. The other thing that disturbs me in all this is that kids from the working class, we'll use that proletarian word wisely here, I hope, they expect punishments more. They defer to authority more.
Certainly. And I think this comes from the fact that oftentimes parents from parents from working class backgrounds themselves understand that their kids are going to be held to higher levels of scrutiny, are going to be judged and potentially punished in harsher ways. And so they oftentimes prepare them for that reality. And so it's hard to say whether that's, those expectations are unfounded, given what we know about the punishment gaps that exist in our schools, given what we know about how, things like implicit bias shape the way that teachers and educators and institutions more generally perceive and treat kids. And so I think it's reasonable on some levels for them to kind of come to the classroom more wary and to be more nervous about the way that they might be treated, be more hesitant about speaking up, given that they might be perceived along stereotypical lines as either too dependent or, not motivated enough, or as, not deserving of that kind of support in school.
So where do we distinguish between race and class in the research that you've done? I know you've done some ethnographic work, and what puzzles me in all this is I've seen some studies that show that the highest self-esteem is among young Black girls, higher than just about any single group. And young Black boys don't seem to necessarily feel they have to defer to authority, or a lot of them don't. So Tell me about the separations from your research.
I mean, I think certainly race and class, by virtue of the way that our society is segregated and by virtue of the long history of racial oppression in this country, we have deep disparities class-wise along racial lines. And certainly what the research shows on that front is that kids from racially marginalized groups are often kind of doubly disadvantaged if they're also in low-income positions or from working class backgrounds. And certainly that can, in some cases, especially if kids are what the research shows is that actually at the elementary level, kids from all racial backgrounds are eagerly motivated when it comes to school, want to succeed, want to do well. But it oftentimes stems from the way that students are mistreated that can help to lead to kind of a falling off of some of that motivation and a falling off of some of that trust in schools when kids are repeatedly subject to discipline, when kids are repeatedly subjected to mistrust from their teachers, and that can, undermine some of the trust that particularly kids from racially and socioeconomically marginalized groups have in schools, and can lead to some of those gaps that start to appear later on in terms of, kids' willingness to defer to authorities, for example, if they just get sort of disillusioned with the project of schooling more generally. Though what the research suggests is that, kids from racially marginalized and socioeconomically marginalized groups, even into high school, and beyond, tend to have fairly high aspirations for themselves. They just don't necessarily always trust that schools will be the ones to help them achieve those kinds of goals. And at the same time, I think what the research on the parental side of things teaches us is that especially for young Black kids, families are often trying to help counter some of the mistreatment that they might face in institutions in terms of not only preparing them for the possibility of bias, but also helping to instill a source of pride and joy in their identities, and to recognize the unique kind of strengths and skills and contributions that they can bring to the classroom, and to remember that, regardless of how they're treated in school.
You've done an extensive amount of research, and you certainly distinguish yourself in your field. I've always sort of wondered, though, how the subjective fits into this kind of research as opposed to the scientific. And they don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive, but you're always interpreting data, and you're interpreting data on the basis of interviews. And it's pretty pluralistic sometimes in terms of these families and the kind of cultural backgrounds they have, despite what their race or class might be. So where does sociology become more than a soft science? And where does it become sound with all those hundreds of papers that are out there, thousands of papers that are out there, and some of them clearly not so sound?
Sure. I mean, I think this is a place where research works not in isolation, but as a collective, in the sense that certainly quantitative studies, survey-based research or experimental research can tell us about associations, can tell us about, how common is it for one group of students to ask for help versus another, or, what is the level of motivation among one group of students versus another. But it can't really tell us the why. It can't tell us where those differences come from. And it also can't tell us, what those differences mean for the students who experience them or for the people who experience them on the ground. And that's where qualitative research, the kind of research that I typically do, helps to fill in the gaps around quantitative research. It helps to identify, what are the mechanisms driving these kinds of patterns that we see in larger scale quantitative studies? Or, what are the implications? What is it like for someone to be living in these kinds of circumstances? And helps to make sense of if we see an association between a particular set of experiences and a particular set of outcomes in life, what is leading to those outcomes? Why is it that, the punishment gap in schools kind of contributes to later life inequalities in income, for example, and trying to get into students' heads and into students' lives and understand, what is it like for them to be in these classrooms? And certainly the idea with qualitative research is rarely to generalize to a population as a whole, but rather to identify a range of possible mechanisms that can help to explain these larger patterns and help to identify the meanings, at least the range of possible meanings that can go with those kinds of experiences too.
Well, then when you find those inequities, it raises serious political questions. I'm going to actually use a couple of examples that have come to the surface just recently and get your response to them. Here in California, they have a Senate which just passed a bill which allows for up to $150,000 loan for immigrant families, undocumented immigrant families, to buy homes. You can imagine how controversial this is. And this is because California is, to a great extent, of course, a blue state and has domination of Democrats. And this is not to be partisan. It's just a fact. And the governor has pretty much spearheaded this, Governor Newsom. And now you have Donald Trump, former president of the United States, saying IVF should be available to anyone, should be, in fact, paid for. I don't know if Mexico is going to pay for it or who's going to pay for it. But in other words, it should be mandatory that insurance companies pay for it or somebody pays for it, again, to break through against inequities. And that question looms in both those examples in my mind, just as a citizen, of what do we do and where do we stop and where are the boundaries in terms of what we need to do?
I mean, I think those are, hard questions to answer. But one thing that I would keep in mind is that particularly when it comes to, I think that the first question that you raised was around immigration. And I think we have to raise the question of, what are immigrants contributing to our society in terms of oftentimes holding jobs that others in our society are less than willing to take, particularly when it comes to undocumented immigrants are often doing jobs that are deeply necessary in, the food industry, in the construction industry, in the agricultural industries. These are places where people are contributing real value to the economy, and yet oftentimes we're not taking care of them with the kinds of policies that we have in place. And so it seems, it seems on the one hand kind of deeply unfair to be asking from people and taking from people in terms of their labor without giving them the kinds of protections that we might to other workers who, have the privilege to be more picky about the kinds of jobs that they take in our economy.
But of course, those who are, let's say in the example I gave here in California, those who want to buy a home and want to save the money to enable them to have a down payment for a home feel there's an inequity where they're concerned. It's the same kind of inequity, I suppose, that many people feel when they're when student loans are forgiven and they had to pay off their student loans. I mean, inequities within inequities. This is labyrinthine, I realize, but it's something that kind of haunts me and cerebrally affects me in different ways.
I mean, I think this is a place where we can challenge the notion. Many of our policies in the U.S. today are built on the notion that people should prove that they are deserving. Prove that they are deserving not only of, the highest paying jobs, but even of a life with dignity. And certainly I think there are other countries that have built social safety nets, that have built social policies that allow all people within their borders to live with dignity, to have access to opportunities, and to have the sort of time and energy, not only to participate in the economy, but also to care for themselves and care for their families and to participate in those kinds of relationships. And I think this is a place where we can push back against some of our sort of historical policy assumptions around, what does it take to be deserving of a roof over your head, deserving of enough food to eat, deserving of access to a high quality education. And certainly that means that there may be opportunities given to younger people in society that, older people didn't have. But I think we can also think about how there are plenty of things that older people had access to that younger generations don't. So for example, with a college education, with the higher levels of federal and state funding that were available for public education, up through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, it was relatively affordable to go to a public institution and get a degree for, $50 a semester, $100 a semester, and even accounting for inflation, those numbers are nowhere near what we're seeing today. And in part because of declining public investments in higher education, the costs of public education, the costs of higher education have skyrocketed. And also because we recognize that students need more support to succeed in college, especially if they're from groups that are historically underrepresented in higher ed. And so this is a place where I think we can recognize that even if it's not a sort of tit for tat model, even if it's that different generations experience different levels of support that look somewhat different, that we can still recognize the value of investing in the future and the value of ensuring that people are able to finish school and go on to lives where they can be deeply productive without being saddled with, huge levels of debts. For my new book, Holding It Together, I followed these 250 families with young children through the first couple years of their children's lives. And the number of families who had over $100,000 and in some cases $300,000 or more in student loan debt from college and from getting graduate degrees, and the way that impacted the choices that they could make, the way it impacted their fertility choices, their housing choices, their choices about what jobs to pursue. I mean, I think this has become a deeply challenging reality that the previous generations of Americans simply haven't had to face in the same way.
You've been bringing some challenges to the whole idea of, well, we don't have a social net, as you've suggested, but also the idea that seems to counter to that everything can be DIY, do it yourself. And this is a meritocracy and somehow operates as a meritocracy. And of course, a lot of that is just illusory. But I'm also interested in what you go into in the historical background of this. You had some Austrian economists who kind of laid the groundwork during FDR's administration. A lot of people don't know about this, but this is really important to understand because it's the antecedent of what we're talking about.
Yeah. And so essentially, in the wake of the Great Depression, in the wake of FDR's New Deal, businesses and wealthy people in the US decided that they didn't want to pay for the kinds of programs that were being put in place to help lift Americans out of a deeply difficult time in our history. And so they started looking for ways to persuade Americans that we didn't need these kinds of investments and that we didn't especially need the kinds of high taxes on, businesses and wealthy people to be able to afford those kinds of policies that other countries were also starting to put in place at the time. And what they found was a group of Austrian economists who were developing neoliberal theory, which is essentially the idea that people and societies are actually better off without investments in strong kind of welfare state or social safety net types of policies, because in the absence of those kinds of policies, the theory goes at least, people will make better choices to keep themselves safe from risk rather than relying on the government to keep them safe from risk instead. Now, this idea has been thoroughly debunked in the sense that this is not how people respond to risk. Putting people in risky situations doesn't lead them to make better choices. But it's a sticky idea, in part because it allows us to believe that, if we just make good choices, we will have the kinds of outcomes in life that we want. And so, those businesses and wealthy people that were sort of a part of the National Association of Manufacturers who found these Austrian economists, at the same time, they wanted to popularize these ideas. And so they imported a group of these economists and installed them at high-profile universities across the U.S., where they went on to train the next generation of economists and business leaders.
Well, they succeeded. Think Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan.
Exactly. Yeah, and certainly, and then laid the groundwork not only for the generations of policy that have followed, the deep ratcheting down of things like tax rates on wealthy people and corporations, but also things like massive propaganda campaigns, things like General Electric Theater, which was hosted by Ronald Reagan and which helped to popularize this idea that people don't need a safety net, that they don't need the government, that if everyone just, pulls themselves up by their own bootstraps, that they'll be able to get ahead.
Well, in fact, I saw some action on what used to be called Twitter and now, of course, is called X, where people were saying, you were saying it was almost as if these people were gaslit, but they were saying, people have choices. And of course, to a great extent, they're right. Somebody can choose not to have a child, for example, even though we like to think that there should be a safety net for those who do. Somebody can choose not to necessarily expend a great deal of revenue when it comes to things that don't necessarily meet their budget or meet the kind of income they're bringing. So where does sort of the whole element of existential choice come into this, as far as you're concerned?
I think certainly choices do matter, but we have to recognize that correlation is not causation, in the sense that, yes, the people who are able to make quote unquote good choices, things like delaying parenthood or, investing in higher education or getting married or, getting a high paying job, that those things are associated with better outcomes in life, but they don't guarantee protections, in the sense that, yes, you may make all those choices, but things can go wrong in your life that can still lead to difficulties and even into poverty and precarity and hardship. And on the flip side of things, those quote unquote good choices are also much easier to make if you are someone who is coming from a background of privilege. And if you're coming from an environment where you are supported in making those kinds of choices for your life. And so I talk in Holding It Together about a number of cases of women whose lives illustrate very clearly the limits of good choices. That even if you're trying to make all the right choices, there's a mom, for example, that I interview for the book, who actually never wanted to be a mom herself, in part because she'd grown up in a very difficult life circumstance. I call her Brooke in the book. And she had, parents who were in a very volatile relationship and never wanted to be a parent herself. But unfortunately, and like many young women, ended up becoming unintentionally pregnant in college. And she initially planned to get an abortion. But her parents, who are conservative evangelical Christians, ultimately talked her out of it. And she was in a position where she was dependent on them for help paying for college and didn't necessarily feel like she had a lot of choice about whether she could say no in that moment, to her parents, and ultimately decided to go through with it. But then once the baby was born, they figured out that they couldn't afford to pay for both college and childcare. And Brooke also didn't trust her parents to watch her son for her at night so that she could take night classes. And so she ended up not only dropping out of college, but, in a sort of rift with her parents, moving into a domestic, into a women's shelter, and then also moving herself onto welfare, and where she ultimately, because of the rules that we have in place for welfare, had to take whatever paid job she could find. And at first that meant a minimum wage part-time job in retail. And even though when she found a full-time job, it was still a low-paying job as a childcare worker. And that job, she liked that job, but it still only paid, just above minimum wage. And even when she got promoted to assistant director of the center, she was still only making $25,000 a year. And so this was just simply, but this was the best job that was available to her as a single mom, raising a son on her own, without a college education that she'd been pushed out of because she'd been pushed into motherhood when she wasn't ready. And so this, to me, is one of the illustrations that even when people try to make the quote unquote right choices, that they're often pushed into circumstances and have limited access to support and limited options available to them in ways that, she wants to go back to college, but she simply hasn't been able to find a way to make it work. She doesn't have the money, to pay for tuition. She can't figure out a way to pay for childcare, for evening care for her kids. And so I think that's a place where, this choice model, yes, choices matter, but they're not enough on their own. And certainly I think we can't blame people for the choices that they make if they're in circumstances where the choices they have are limited in the first place.
Well, you bring some pretty hard cases to our attention, very poignant. In fact, a woman you call Akari, who I think is from Indiana, when you were in Indiana, actually 3 children and became a widow, and suddenly her whole life was fated by the fact that her husband died and her whole income changed and so forth. I mean, there's so many cases like that. But there are, of course, independent cases where people have choices and they make the wrong choices, or they shouldn't have kids and they do, or those kinds of things. But we can maybe let things open here because we're hearing from a lot of people, and I want to get to as many questions as we can. We're talking, if you just joined us, with Jessica Calarco, who is a sociologist and author. And questions start out in Eureka, California, from Paul, who says, since you write so much about education, we're getting some questions sort of in the realm of education. He wants to know, how can technology help level the field in education?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a place where certainly, and I've actually done some research on this as well, that one of the challenges is that, technology is an important part of children's educations and children's lives today. And there are still huge gaps. It's easy to think that, today's young people are the tech generation, that they're growing up, with these, tech savvy lives. But that's actually not the case universally, that there are still large gaps in terms of who is able to access technologies, who has access even to high-speed internet at home is not a given for many young people, particularly in rural communities and particularly in lower income communities in the US. And so that's a place where investments in things like public Wi-Fi or in, affordable programs to make high-speed internet accessible to families is very important. And even for college students, there in some of the research that I've done, students from low-income backgrounds and students from racially marginalized groups may have technology that they bring to campus with them, but it's often lower quality technology that breaks down more often, that they end up having more problems with, and they often don't have the money to replace if things break or get lost or stolen or other things happen. And so this becomes a huge challenge, and that the students who struggle more with access to reliable technologies end up having lower grades, end up having more stress in school. And so this is a place where ensuring that all students have kind of equitable and equal access to the kinds of technologies that they need to be successful academically is something that we should be ensuring that schools are funded to the level where they're able to provide, and ensuring that communities are able to provide that kind of support, for families and for young people too, especially if we're in an era where, kids can be pushed to distance learning or at-home learning when there's a snowstorm or when there's a fire or when there's other kinds of challenges. If they're sick, that students are still expected to log on from home in ways that simply aren't possible for many young people today. And so I think that's where, a place where ensuring equal access and equitable access to technology is incredibly important for kids these days.
Let me thank Paul for the question and go to another question that's sort of apropos of the previous question in some ways. This is Susan in Charlotte, North Carolina, and she wants to know, what is your perspective on the school choice movement, including charter schools and vouchers? How do these options affect educational equity?
I mean, I think unfortunately what the data tells us on that front is that these kinds of options have operated primarily to undermine kind of public support for traditional public schools in ways that in many cases have exacerbated inequalities and inequities as opposed to addressing them. That the quality that we're seeing from charter schools is often not uniform, and that those kinds of schools are often not equitably or equally served serving, students in ways that help to address the broader patterns of inequality. And so I think really what the data show us on that front is that we need ways of investing more strongly in our existing public schools and ensuring that families have access to high quality, well-funded public schools with teachers that are well supported in their jobs, that these are the kinds of things that really matter, for the quality of education that schools are able to provide, and addressing certainly the kinds of challenges that students face in their home lives as well, that these are the biggest predictors, of students' success in schools, and that simply tinkering with, the regulatory structure of education or adding more school choice doesn't address these kinds of deeper problems with education, or deeper problems in terms of the challenges that students face outside of school. And that if we really want to raise test scores or ensure that all students are on a more equal footing, that we really need to ensure that we're providing adequate public support, that we're investing in public schooling, and that we're doing so in ways that help to ensure that all parents can trust their local schools, as opposed to leading them to have even more distrust in the local institutions by virtue of giving them lots of choices and not a lot of information about whether those choices will actually pay off in the end.
On the whole, what you say is very wise and sound, and I would agree with you in terms of supporting the public schools. But the reality, let me just get your response to this, is that there are charter schools that do much better than the public schools. There are charter schools that are really quite successful in terms of equity in education for those who can afford them and those who go there. So you do have a mix, and that mix can be confusing.
It is. And that's a place where I think we have to also be careful about selection versus, influence when it comes to, what is leading to those differences. And what the data show on that front is that some of those schools that have been the most effective are often very selective about which students, they're allowing in, and it's not necessarily that they are equally good at serving all students. Students with disabilities, for example, may struggle in those environments, even if they're better for other students. And so I think we have to be careful about assuming that just because a charter school shows success with a small group of students, that it's necessarily scalable to input those kinds of policies or those kinds of programs more universally. Certainly, there are some great examples that we can learn from, but we have to be careful about the loss of trust that can come with pushing those models, and also the fact that certainly hasn't been the case across the board.
And here's Frank. I don't mention last names, but he has one that's famous from my hometown, Cleveland, and he's in Austin, Texas. Wants to know if you can discuss the concept of the hidden curriculum in schools. How does it influence students' academic and social development? Well, what's meant by the hidden curriculum, first of all?
Yeah, so the hidden curriculum, this term has been used in a couple of different ways, but when I use it in my own research, I'm primarily talking about the idea that there are things that schools expect students to know, and that students need to know in order to be successful, both academically and often in life more generally, that aren't explicitly taught. Some of my writing around this is around sort of succeeding in graduate school, and that there's kind of a hidden curriculum even for students who make it all the way to master's or PhD programs, things that they're just expected to know about how to navigate academia, how publishing works, how to find a good advisor, things that we don't typically teach students as part of the curriculum, but that ultimately matter a great deal for their success in graduate school and in the kinds of careers they might pursue after getting a master's or a PhD. And the same thing happens at all levels of education. If you think all the way down to kindergarten, kids are expected to come in often, knowing how to sit still, knowing how to make a line to go to the bathroom or to go to lunch, knowing how to tie their own shoes, knowing how to, even kind of think in academic terms in terms of questions and answers, where a teacher asks a question and students are supposed to raise their hand and answer. And if we just assume by default that students are coming in with that kind of experiential knowledge, then it often privileges students who've had access to things like, high quality preschool education, which isn't a guarantee for all kids in this country in terms of access, and can create inequalities even among very young children that then persist in terms of their readiness for school and how that plays out for their outcomes in the long term.
Maybe you could say something, since you wrote a book about graduate school and graduate education and how to prepare for it. As a professor for many years, I found it challenging, and that's an understatement, when students would come to me and say, I want to go to graduate school because I want to be a scholar and get my PhD and get an academic position. If they were white males, I knew that they, to some extent, probably had some strikes against them, because there is a kind of preference now that's real and it's palpable, and you can't deny it in terms of wanting to get, in the name of equity. I understand that, affirmative action. We don't want to open up those cans of worms. But what do you say to a young white male who says, I want to pursue a PhD and go to graduate school because I want an academic position, when chances are unlikely that position will be open to him or her even.
I mean, actually, what the data show on that front is that, white men are still vastly overrepresented when it comes to the new hiring that's happening at universities. I mean, more so in some disciplines than in others. But across the board, it's not that they are doing worse than than kind of representativeness, at least. That it's not that young white men are now underrepresented in terms of.
I'm thinking about my own field in the humanities, where it's
Sure. And certainly there may be, this is a place where there are differences across fields, but on the whole in academia, they're still, it's not that we have seen a sort of flipping of the script in terms of who is most likely to be hired or most likely to be employed. And actually that the disparities are even larger when we see who gets tenure in terms of, who is actually able to progress and who is able to be promoted within academia. At the same time, I think it's important to think about, for those young men, if they're interested in pursuing graduate school, not to discourage them, but to help them understand, the landscape that they're in and the value of having a diverse workforce and a diverse, set of experiences that are represented because of the way that the student body is changing. And what we know about things like student belonging and student trust in institutions, that for students of color, for women students, for international students, for students from low-income backgrounds, having professors who look like them matters a great deal in terms of their ability to find mentors, in terms of their ability to feel a sense of belonging in college, in order to, feel that they are supported in the kind of work that they want to do. And so this is a place where it's very important for the workforce of academia to reflect the realities of our students and the changing composition of our student body in ways that can help all of our students to be more successful, in part by seeing people who look like them, who can help them to feel, valued and like as though they belong within that particular space.
Well, not only in academia, it was very telling. I know some people may have seen the presentation, the interview with Waltz and Harris, where they showed that picture of Kamala Harris's great niece looking at her and just staring at her with the pigtails. And I mean, it spoke volumes about exactly what you're describing here. What about patriarchy and all this? I mean, you write about it and you bring attention to it and make us aware of the fact that there are perks that go with patriarchy particularly, and there's a kind of a Mars-Venus mythic dichotomy.
Yeah, and this is a place where I think, we've talked a bit about this DIY society model. And I think what's important to recognize here is that this model, this neoliberal model that we have, where instead of investing in policies that help people live with dignity and access opportunities and contribute to a shared project of care, we tell people in the US to take care of themselves and to do so without relying on the governments for support. And, the problem with this is that not everyone can take care of themselves. We have a system where there are young children, there are elderly people, there are people who are sick or disabled who need care from others. And so what we do in order to maintain this kind of neoliberal illusion of a DIY society is push that work of caring for other people, kind of maintaining that DIY illusion. We push that work disproportionately onto women who do the work of caring, the unpaid care work of caring for the people in their families, and often also the underpaid care work, the work as childcare providers, as home health aides, as, people working in social service industries that are often among the lowest paid jobs in our economy and that are disproportionately filled not only by women, but especially by women of color and by women from low-income families who are doing this work that actually helps to make, doing paid work more affordable and easier for the people who can afford to outsource care. That even as much as childcare costs right now, it would cost even more if we had to pay decent wages to the people who are providing that care. And to get back to the point of patriarchy, in this system, and in part because of how women are pushed into these lower paying occupations to make that care more affordable for the people who need it, it leads to gender pay gaps. It leads to the kinds of situations where the careers disproportionately held by men are paid more than the careers held by women. And so in many families, it makes more sense for men to focus on paid work, to be the primary breadwinner, and for women to kind of do other types of work in their families if they have to make a choice. Childcare costs so much that many families simply can't afford to have both parents working full time. But the problem is that the men in those families, the men who are in a position to feel pressured, to provide as much as they can economically for their families, don't want to feel bad about themselves, don't want to feel like bad guys guys, if they are asking the women around them, if they're sort of pushing that care work onto their wives, onto their girlfriends, onto their mothers, if you're talking about young men taking their laundry home to mom, for example, they don't want to feel bad about doing that, in part because it allows them to get ahead in their careers, which is what our economy demands. And so the problem there is that, unfortunately, this kind of sexist mythology, what I talk about in my book is as the myth of Mars and Venus, but it's sort of classic, patriarchal thinking or sexist or misogynistic thinking, is that, well, this is just, women are just naturally better suited for caregiving, and women are just naturally happier in these kinds of caregiving roles. And so in order to not see themselves as bad guys, in order to feel like they're not exploiting the women around them, it becomes very easy for young men in particular, if they haven't made it yet, but really for all men, to buy into those kinds of rhetorics in ways that then can ultimately undermine, their willingness to support the kinds of policies, things like universal child care, things like guaranteed paid family leave, things like higher minimum wages, which disproportionately affect women, because men sort of feel like, well, she's just happiest at home. So it's perfectly fine if, I focus on paid work and she does all of the caregiving, even if, that means that his job is 9 to 5, but hers is 24/7 in the end.
And she's maternal, and maternal is what women are. But, you point out that women are kind of creating the safety net, holding it together in many ways. The counter argument to that is that all these glass ceilings are smashed now, or being smashed, that pay equity. I mean, there is, certainly data that can support most of the feminist arguments, but yet at the same time, we've been through a feminist revolution. Things have changed enormously.
I mean, certainly I think we've seen progress for women on some fronts, but less so on others, in the sense that, yes, women are now going to college at much higher rates than they were before. But at the same time, we're still seeing
much higher rates than men, I believe.
Yes, and even higher rates than men. Though if you look at things like who's going to the most selective schools, you still see advantages for men in those kinds of cases. And so who's getting into Harvard versus who's going to the local community college or the local, the regional state campus, there's big disparities still there as well. But at the same time, where we haven't seen as much progress is actually on the employment front. Yes, there are cases of women who are breaking the glass ceiling, but what research tells us there's a really interesting experimental study that was done recently by one of my former graduate students, Natasha Quadlin, where she gave resumes to employers and had them evaluate which candidates they would bring in, for interviews or to potentially hire. And what she found was that actually high-achieving women were less likely to be selected than lower-achieving men. They gave them candidates who were college graduates. And there was a penalty, actually, for women who had A's in college because they were seen by employers as kind of too uptight and not likable enough. Whereas men who got B's and C's were seen as, they'll be good team players, they'll be good for this organization. They fit better here. And so I think we have to be careful about assuming that all of the barriers have been broken down. And certainly when it comes to care work, I mean, I've seen, sociologists have talked about this as the unfinished revolution, in the sense that, yes, we've seen advances for women in terms of paid work, but what we haven't seen is men taking up an equal responsibility for the unpaid care work in their families and in their communities. And this leads to ongoing inequalities in the sense that women have this double shift that, yes, men have taken on a little bit more of, but is still deeply unequal. Women still do roughly twice as much unpaid care work every day than men do in terms of things like childcare, house cleaning, caring for elderly family members, the mental load of figuring out scheduling and logistics and how to run a household and what's in the fridge and what needs to be picked up from the grocery store, that all of this work still disproportionately falls to women in ways that ultimately lead to stereotypes from employers that lead them to especially discount mothers of young children and to pass over them for opportunities for advancement. There's still a very substantial motherhood penalty where, mothers compared to fathers of young kids, it's something like 68 cents on the dollar that mothers of young kids make in the workforce. And so I think that the penalties on that front are too big to ignore.
Well, you mentioned Harvard, and it set off a whole chain of associations in my mind with what you've said about time to maybe do away with this snobbery and excessive attention to Ivy League schools. I mean, the idea of getting kids into the special schools of the East now is going through maybe a transformation because of the kind of problems those schools have had, particularly with respect to anti-Semitism and discrimination of other sorts. I'm just wondering where you see this leading. I mean, ultimately where it should lead, that we shouldn't be so obsessed with the Ivy League schools. I agree with you, I mean, in principle, but what does that translate to?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a place where certainly, Ivy League institutions and other elite schools in our society have long dominated the conversation around higher education. And in our current environment, there is still a premium for students who go to those schools, in the sense that employers still look very favorably on students who graduate with those kinds of, elite degrees, even compared to students with similar profiles who've gone to public institutions, for example. And so I think it's reasonable why families want very much to get their kids into these schools, particularly given the inequalities in our society. The more precarity that we face, the more inequality that families see in our society, the more that those with a little bit of privilege want to leverage that privilege to help ensure that their own children, have access to that spot at the top of the ladder, to maintain the kinds of privileges and advantages that they've been able to enjoy, throughout their lives so far. But at the same time, I think we have to think carefully about the role that elite institutions have long played in helping to promote this idea, kind of getting back to the conversation we had earlier about sort of, competition versus just basic human dignity as the basis of, who deserves a good life in our society. And certainly elite institutions have played a role in promoting this notion that only the best and the brightest, deserve to lead our society. Only the quote unquote best and brightest, deserve the kinds of opportunities of a good life in our society. And, they've done so in ways that have helped fill their own pockets and build their own endowments, but that haven't necessarily helped to reduce inequalities in society as a whole. And certainly they are making, some inroads on that front in terms of making, substantial scholarships and student aid available to students from lower income backgrounds. But it's only a drop in the bucket compared to the huge number of students that are going to college today. And that really, I think what we need is...
And the legacies are still, sorry to interrupt you, but the legacies
No.
are still disproportionately overrepresented.
Yes, certainly. Students who are legacies, and even when we think about college athletes, what the research tells us on that front is that the students who are disproportionately admitted as athletes to elite schools are white students, and students from relatively affluent families. Because yes, there's the football team and the basketball team, but there's also the sailing team and the crew team, and the other teams that are disproportionately, and the fencing team that are disproportionately made up of students from wealthy white backgrounds. And so actually, athlete advantages often serve to further admit white students as well.
And James from San Francisco wants to know if you can tell us about your research process for your book. Now, you have 3 books, so I'm not sure what she's referring to, if she means a specific book or maybe just how you do research.
Sure. I mean, so maybe for the most recent book, as an example for holding it together, we started with, I was interested, before I wrote this book, about what I thought of at the time as the best laid plans of parenting, in terms of the idea that we have ideas about the kind of parent that we want to be for our kids, but life often intervenes, often in deeply unequal ways. And I was interested in seeing what are the kinds of challenges that families face? How does it push them off course in terms of the decisions that they plan to make for their children? And how do they navigate in the process of those potential setbacks? And so I started with a team of graduate and undergraduate students recruiting 250 pregnant women from prenatal clinics around Indiana. And then we asked them a very extensive survey about all of the decisions that they planned to make for their new babies, and then followed up with them every 6 months. So it's 6 months and 12 months and 18 months postpartum, to ask them about, not only additional surveys, but also in-depth interviews to kind of get to know them and learn more about their lives and the decisions that they were making. And that project we started in 2018 and 2019. And so we were still in the field when the pandemic hit in 2020. And so, we'd pivoted to doing a lot of interviews by Zoom already, in part because some families had moved away. And what became very apparent from those kind of very early pandemic interviews was how much of an impact COVID was having on families with young children, and particularly on the women in those families who were not only, doing the bulk of the childcare when schools and childcare centers closed, but also making sure that grandma got her meds, making sure that neighbors got food when they got sick, filling in for colleagues who were sick in ways that, disproportionately created stress and heartache and hardship for families and for women in particular. And so we did 3 additional waves of pandemic data collection with those families that we'd been following, and then also fielded 2 national surveys with about 2,000 parents each to see kind of how this was impacting families, not only these 250 families that we've been following on a deep level, but also to get a sense of how might this vary across different groups or across different parts of the US. And that's that kind of a mixed methods approach, kind of combining different types of data, whether it's qualitative data like I can do from the interviews or like large scale survey data to track broader patterns. I like to be able to combine those different types of insights to answer different types of questions and to better kind of flesh out and round out our understandings of patterns, whether that's on the school side of the equation or whether that's when it comes to things like gender inequalities at home.
Was your University of Pennsylvania graduate education really primarily responsible for what you just laid out for us in terms of methodology?
Certainly. I mean, I think I worked very closely with Annette Leroux as my primary advisor, and she's a well-known sociologist and ethnographer and interviewer who's quite literally written the book on qualitative methods. And so certainly she's someone who deeply informed my thinking about how to do qualitative research. And at the same time, I worked very closely with a number of folks who are experts in survey methodologies and quantitative data, people like Grace Cow and Frank Furstenberg at Penn, who taught me about sort of the value of those types of data and thinking strategically about how to combine those insights to be able to tell bigger stories that we can't tell with one type of data alone.
Big question from Peter. Thank you for the question. Tucson, Arizona wants to know, where do you see trade schools fitting into the education puzzle?
I mean, this is one of the places in our education system where I think we've severely underinvested. Public education as a whole is a place where we often haven't put in sufficient thought into how to prepare students for the jobs of the future and to make sure that we're meeting students' needs where they are, as opposed to just pushing students into a sort of one-size-fits-all model of what future success looks like. And trade schools are a place where we could invest much more heavily, particularly if we're trying to pivot to a greener economy, for example, that this could be a place where we had, large-scale federal investments in trade schools as a way to ensure that we're preparing students for the kinds of jobs in, high-tech facilities, where they're producing, green technologies or to innovate in those kinds of fields. I think this is a place where we could be investing more, and where, if anything, what we've seen is oftentimes cutbacks and closures, particularly for the smaller schools that are publicly run in states that haven't invested as much in higher education. So I think this is a place where we could, think more strategically about ways to support students and support our economy too.
I think it makes great sense to really support trade schools and put more investment in trade schools. I've been saying it for years. And Karen from St. Louis wants to know how community colleges provide opportunities for first-generation college students.
Absolutely. And this is another place where we've seen kind of strategic underinvestment. And what we know is that the students who are using community colleges are disproportionately first-generation students from low-income backgrounds, students of color, for whom these are both, a good option in terms of the costs associated with these programs, and also allow them to stay closer to home. These are oftentimes not traditionally aged students. They're typically students who have families, who have young children, who have elderly parents that they're caring for, often who are working full-time jobs on top of going to school. And at the same time, they're often in very precarious positions financially. There's research showing that, large percentages, over 10% of community college students experience kind of housing instability or food instability while they're going to college. And this is a place where Sarah Goldrick-Rab, who's a sociologist, has done great work on the importance of ensuring that people who are going to school have access to things like food stamps in ways that they often, going to school often doesn't qualify as work in ways that you may have in place for work requirements, or access to free lunch programs for these students in ways that can help to extend them and make them more accessible, not only in terms of the tuition benefits, but in terms of the life benefits or the life support that needs to be in place to allow students to take advantage of those kinds of opportunities that exist in their communities as well.
You have a phrase which caught my attention that I would like to ask you about: lingering inequities. What are the lingering inequities?
In terms of education, or in terms
of education, yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think this is a place where certainly we've seen more students going to college in recent years, but disproportionately, it's still students from more privileged backgrounds who are able to not only go to college, but complete college and, succeed academically in college and go on to translate their degrees into high-earning careers. And so when I talk about lingering inequities in higher education, it's that just going to college, kind of any college, isn't necessarily enough. This gets back to the idea that good choices won't necessarily save us, in that just going to college doesn't necessarily necessarily guarantee a stable, secure life for people going forward. I interviewed, for my own project, for example, many mothers who pursued degrees in fields like social work, and then who found once they became parents themselves that those jobs often paid, around $30,000 a year, which wasn't enough to cover the cost of childcare, for their own children. And that at the same time, if they were married, they often made too much as a household to qualify for the minimal subsidies that we do provide, for families in terms of childcare. And so it made more sense financially for them to drop out of the workforce rather than continuing to work as social workers or sometimes even as teachers, in our economy, because those jobs are simply so deeply underpaid. And in many of those families, mothers actually had higher levels of education than their partners. They'd gone on to get master's degrees in social work or teaching, but were still paid less than their partners in ways that made it make sense for them to be the ones to sacrifice their careers, to stay home when they would have been cash negative if they'd both kept working for pay full time.
Well, trade schools could provide a better income in so many instances than a baccalaureate degree, especially in the liberal arts fields. It's another reason for an argument, just pragmatic argument behind trade schools. But I have another question from Reed, one of our regular questioners. Thank you for this, Reed. He says, do you feel there is any hope that government can affect taxation policy that could help alleviate the strains in education, childcare, and economic disparities?
Absolutely. I think what we've seen from examples of states around the country is that it is certainly possible to put in place more equitable taxation policies. I mean, we've seen a dramatic ratcheting down of the top tax rates since the 1950s and 60s in terms of, the rates for high earning corporations and the rates for the highest earning individuals, that's shifting back to more historic rates in terms of taxation at the very top of the economic ladder could put huge amounts of money into our political system to pay for the kinds of policies that other countries take for granted. Things like universal affordable childcare, things like well-funded schools, things like free college tuition, things like ensuring that companies don't have to bear the full brunt of paid family leave policies, for example, because there are government-paid kind of substitute workers that can fill in for gaps when employees have to take leave. And so there are lots of ways that we could, use the money that already exists in our economy to help fund these kinds of policies that the vast majority of Americans desperately want. But right now, that money is just in the wrong hands. And certainly, I think this is a place where, getting back to that sort of neoliberal thinking that we were talking about before, a tax on government, a tax on taxation coming out of people like Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan have made Americans afraid of taxes in ways that they often shouldn't be because of how taxation, when structured the right way, can actually help to benefit the vast majority of Americans while simply taking away just a little bit from the people at the top to redistribute it in ways that can help to leave us all better off in the end.
You see these startling numbers. I've seen them, and you've probably seen them, and many of our listeners have probably seen them, about just the small percentage in taxation that could be taken from Elon Musk's income or Jeff Bezos's income or Warren Buffett's or any of those people who are way out on the top, and they'd still be worth billions and billions of dollars. I mean, it's a bit appalling, really, when you think about it. Doesn't mean you have to be, Bernie Sanders type of neo-socialist or anything like that. It's just a reality of people. They get the tax breaks rather than get the taxation. I mean, Buffett has pointed out, for example, that secretary who work for him pays more taxes than he does, and he finds that appalling.
Exactly. And this is, a function of the fact that we have for decades allowed billionaires and big corporations to leverage their wealth to influence politics in ways that carve out those loopholes and give them the opportunity to save as much of their own money as possible while forcing taxes onto people below them on the ladder in ways that, and while also selling this myth that taxes are, bad for Americans at the same time that they are skirting those policies and skirting that taxation and even, pushing their money offshore in ways that can help protect it as well. And so this is a place where I think we have, even small tweaks in our tax structure and in the kinds of policies that we have in place could dramatically reshape the resources that we have available to provide the kinds of programs that we need.
But even your Austrian economists, or those who subscribe to their thinking and ideology, could not have imagined something like Citizens United, where corporations become individuals.
Exactly.
And that's what we see.
Yeah, and I think that is a key example of the way that wealth has been leveraged to influence policy in our society. And we saw it play out with Build Back Better in the sense that we came incredibly close to passing the American Families Plan, which included things like guaranteed paid leave, higher federal minimum wage laws, universal child care. And ultimately, the votes against it from, not only the Republican side of the equation, but also folks like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, they were paid for by the same big donors who funded Donald Trump's campaign. And even though it nominally, Sinema and Manchin were Democrats at the time, the money flowing into their pockets was coming from the Republican side of the equation in ways that persuaded them to vote against those policies and ultimately killed our shot at having those policies in the shorter term. That we could be in a very, very different situation right now, if not for Citizens United, if not for the way that we allow corporate money and big kind of and big donor money into politics in ways that can dramatically swing outcomes and push us away from the policies that the vast majority of us want.
This is a thorny question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you say to those who say we live in a capitalist system, and if we want capitalism, we have to accept inequities? That's the nature of capitalism.
Well, I think there's a difference between capitalism and profit-focused capitalism in the sense that what we have now is a market capitalistic system where really it's not just about, capitalism is selling your labor for wages. That is capitalism at its core. But the capitalism that we practice now is not just selling your labor for wages, but selling your labor for wages at rates that are so low that it leaves huge amounts of profits left over to go into the pockets of the shareholders who, own corporations, and also into the pockets of the people who own stocks in corporations. And we have built our whole kind of system around banking on the continued future growth of our economic system in ways that are kind of go well beyond what most people think of when they think of just basic capitalism. And it's really that constant pursuit of ever growing profits that, if we think about things like the 401k programs, we're betting our retirement on the assumption that companies will continue to grow, which means that they need to kind of keep further exploiting their workers, paying them less and less and less relative to the actual value that they're contributing, or cheapening products, making them kind of worse and worse and worse quality, or charging more and more and more for those products, as we've seen, over the last couple of years, to keep growing their profits in ways that will keep stock prices rising, in ways that will allow the, not all of us who have stocks to be able to maybe have a shot at a good retirement someday. And so this kind of a system, I think it's this sort of perversion of capitalism where we're trying to pursue not just the exchange of labor for wages, but trying to fill the pockets of shareholders with as much money as possible. That is what's really complicating and arguably ruining our society in terms of our chances of being able to have the kind of universal dignity that we really need.
Isn't that why we have unions? A lot of the big reason behind the union movement and why it's established and why it's so important in this country?
Absolutely.
And Marx never would have imagined the power that unions have, never would have conceived of it.
And certainly unions do play an essential role in helping to push back against the power of corporations and the power of their shareholders. But what we've seen in recent decades, with the exception, we've seen a kind of slight shift back in the other direction in the past couple of years with big union wins. But historically, since the 1950s and 60s, we've seen a dramatic ratcheting down of the kind of percentage of Americans who are part of labor unions, driven in part by the same kind of Reagan-era rhetoric and kind of Milton Friedman-esque rhetoric that helped to persuade people that unions were bad, that they were responsible for, driving up costs in ways that really it's profit seeking that drives up costs and not oftentimes labor or wages that is actually affecting the kinds of prices, at least primarily, that we end up paying. And so it's a lot of fear mongering around unions that has driven workers to be more skeptical of unions and certainly allowed policies to be put in place in many states across the country that limit union organizing and that limit union bargaining in ways that have research has shown dramatically impacted the share of wealth that goes to workers and made it much easier to see these huge disparities between worker pay and CEO pay or executive pay that we see in corporations today.
Can you give us some wisdom on how you decide where to put the priorities? I mean, when you think of inequities, think of education, think of healthcare, think of, economic inequities, obviously, but also social inequities, racial inequities. I mean, the list just goes on, almost ad infinitum. Where to place the greatest emphasis or necessity?
I mean, I think I like to think about changes to policies. There's lots of different ways to proceed. But in terms of the policies that we need, I think there's three core things that we need to pursue as we're thinking about better policies to put in place. And that's first, that we want to ensure that all people are able to live lives with dignity, that they have their basic needs met in terms of things like affordable housing, access to healthy food, access to clean water, that these kinds of, access to elder care when you're not able to care for yourself anymore, that these kinds of access to healthcare to keep yourself safe and healthy, that this is about a basic level of dignity for all people. The next step then is to think about access to opportunities and ensuring that all people are able to think about moving beyond their current circumstances through things like access to, a free college education, for example, or access to even childcare for your own children so that you can pursue a paid job in ways that you might not be able to if you didn't have access to that kind of care. And then the third piece is about ensuring that people have the time and energy to contribute to a shared project of care. And this is where things like paid family leave come in to make sure that parents have the time to care for their new babies and recover from childbirth. And then also, in addition to that, things like paid vacation time or limits on paid work hours. Places like France have seen tremendous success in limiting the number of paid work hours that the vast majority of workers work, ensuring access to things like paid vacation time. And those policies have, left workers happier, have left workers oftentimes more productive, and have also reduced gender inequalities, both in paid work and in unpaid work, in the sense that when you have less pressure to commit as much of your life as possible to the kind of paid workforce, you have more time to share equitably in the work of caring for your families, caring for your communities, and also taking care of yourself, more time to sleep, more time for leisure activities, more time for joy. And so I think these kinds of sets of policies are the ways that we can, starting with dignity, moving to opportunities, and then thinking about an equitable sharing of care and a pushback against the sort of demands that paid work often makes on us in our economy. That's the kind of policy environment that I'd hope that we aim for moving forward.
And a safety net. I mean, we looked at Scandinavian countries again with, I think, a great deal of earnestness and possibility, even though we're such a huge, larger, heterogeneous population. But nevertheless, they seem to get it right a lot of the time. And what's next for you? What are you doing now?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly I have a lot of data left over from the project that went into this new book, holding it together. And I think one of the things that I've been particularly interested in coming out of this project is the role that evangelical Christianity is playing in shaping some of the patterns and some of the pushback that we're seeing around the social safety net, and trying to better understand the pressures that families face when they are kind of intensively religiously committed, the way that shapes family decision making, the way that shapes kind of relationship decision making within couples, and the role that it shapes, or the role that it plays in shaping people's trust in society as a whole. So I think that's probably where I'm headed with some of my next projects.
Well, we wish you the best. And let me, before I say goodbye to you, thank all who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can listen to live every Friday, 11 a.m. Pacific time. But you can also listen to us on Apple, Spotify, and our website at graymatter.show. And if you haven't yet become a member of the podcast, I invite you to join by going to our website at graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. And again, that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions, suggestions you might have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. That's Krasny. My thanks to our Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Cullen, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya. And a special thanks to our guest, Jessica Calarco. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.